good afternoon for our session of diplomacy, your questions, our answers. This afternoon, it's a real pleasure to have Professor Shlomo Ben-Ami with us. Welcome, Professor Ben-Ami.
Thank you.
Professor Ben-Ami is our first ever online Israel Institute visiting professor at the Vienna School of International Studies. And he's not only with us this afternoon, but he's also with us for students in these months. Unfortunately, only not on campus, but I understand, in Tel Aviv. But it's great to have you with us. Let me say a few words only on Professor Ben-Ami. For those of you who are not familiar, he is one of those great Israeli guys who managed to combine academics, real academic work, with political work and diplomatic work. One could say, in the case of Israel, everybody should actually be a person like Professor Ben-Ami. He has studied history, not only in Israel, but also in Oxford at St. Anthony's College. He has been teaching history there in Israel and in other places, including again in Oxford. Then he was also as a member of Knesset for some years, and as acting and as foreign minister of Israel in the year 2000. These were very difficult years with all these sort of negotiations with the Palestinians at that time. This was an experience, I guess, which is very, very important also for his continuous academic work and work in peacemaking and negotiation processes. Professor Ben-Ami has also later on worked in a lot of international institutions on negotiation. Among other things, he served as a board member of the International Crisis Group, and he published also quite a number of books, starting with a book on the origins of the Second Republic in Spain and on fascism seen from above, Oxford University Press. But this was just an introduction to let you know who our speaker this afternoon is. The topic is a huge one. We have chosen the topic, does the Corona crisis herald paradigmatic change in the world order? So the question is, what does it mean, world order? What does it mean, paradigmatic change? And what does Corona crisis mean? And I'm very much looking forward to, we will get answers, or we will understand the questions better. Every day we hear at the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna experts saying that everything will be different after the Corona crisis. And with everyone I listen to, I get more and more the impression that maybe nothing we will get different after the Corona crisis. I don't much believe in behavioral change of people because of this crisis. I don't see the real economic change, maybe with the exception that even more capitalism will rule the world. And I don't see that the big players in the world will really be in a different situation afterwards. But maybe I'm totally wrong, and that's why I'm looking forward to listen to Professor Shlomo Ben-Ami, and I give the floor to you, Professor.
Thank you very much also, Mr. Briggs, for your kind introduction. Well, this is going to be a very brief and telegraphic march through what I believe are the essentials of what seems to be the legacy and the consequences of the coronavirus crisis in two main spheres. One is the systemic challenges of different states, of the nation state, and another is the challenges or whether or not we are going to see changes in the global geostrategic game. This one is more state-focused, another more internationally focused. Pandemics throughout history have created major paradigmatic changes. If you think of the Antonine pandemic in the 2nd century, it was very important in enhancing the chances of Christianity in the Roman Empire, because the pagan empire was hit by mysterious forces, and then people shifted more forcefully towards Christianity. Or if you take the the Justinian plague of the 6th and 7th century, it in many ways defined the outer limits of Byzantium expansion, and therefore it changed, or it created a new different balance in the Eastern Mediterranean and in Europe as a whole. Or you take the Spanish flu, which the only thing that we know for sure about it is that it was not Spanish. I mean, it started in the United States, of all places. The Spanish flu, for example, started to unleash the process which eventually brought about decolonization. India was a case in point. India was punished very severely by the Spanish flu, and therefore you could see that the consequences of the plague of the flu were linked, or they converged with the consequences of World War I to create the major crisis between the two world wars. Now, we should never underestimate the resilience of the power and the power of continuity. That is, rarely, if ever, history offers one single inflection point to explain history's change of course. But nonetheless, being such a colossal event, such a meta-historical event, it always has its impact. My main thesis to you today, if we want to debate it, is that the difference between the corona crisis and previous pandemics is that the paradigmatic change took place on the eve of the pandemic already. And the pandemic only gave it a further push, it consolidates it. But the change started to occur earlier. For example, the economic depression inherited from the 2008 financial pandemic, deglobalization, with the concomitant rise, or the concomitant rise possibly of a Westphalian order and the balance of power to replace the multilateral culture that emerged in the wake of the end of Cold War. This happened before the pandemic. This shift to unilateralism, the erosion of multilateral institutions, authoritarian surveillance capitalism, technology in the service of surveillance of citizens' privacy, and the possible shift of US-China tensions into a full-fledged Cold War. All of this was not created by the pandemic. It occurred before the pandemic, only that the pandemic gave it enhanced it and helped consolidate it into the new reality we are living through. Inevitably, economic disruption, again, that we got COVID-19 in the middle of economic disruption. So it was not invented by COVID-19. We haven't truly supersede the consequences of 2008. Recovery was extremely fragile, was extremely low throughout the world, including China, after 2008. So we are now in the need to move inevitably to more Keynesian socio-economic policies at a time when deficits are already at prohibitive levels. So, and therefore, inevitably, the recession is going to persist for a while, and the possibility of covering or deficits will not be that simple. Now, I think it was again John Maynard Keynes who said that political extremism is the child of bad economics. So political extremism, again, started in the wake of 2008, which rhymes in a way with 1929. It rhymes with it in the sense that both financial pandemics, in a way, unleashed processes of populism, of the rise of authoritarianism, of extreme right-wing movements, and it happened after 1929 and after 2008, and seemingly they persist after COVID. If we see these movements protesting globalization, we should not be surprised. We saw it even before the pandemic. We have seen processes of deglobalization, and I think that the post-pandemic world will be marked by tighter restrictions on the movement of goods, services, capital, technology, data, and information. I would like to quote to you Macron, President Macron from France, who said a couple of days ago, the challenges of Corona that Corona has revealed are the fragilities of our economies and our excessive dependence on other continents to procure certain products. Too much dependence on China, too much dependence on the global chain. And therefore, I think that we might see that these processes that started already before have received and are receiving now an impulse. One important victory, I think, during the crisis is that of big government, state capabilities. People came to the state for their protection, not to multilateral organizations, not to the WHO, not to the European Union, not to the United Nations. They came to the state, to the services of the state. And those states that abdicated the capacities of the central government by outsourcing them, by privatizing them, performed less well or worse than those who had bigger government. Look at the United Kingdom, for example. With less investment in public capacity has come in the UK a loss of institutional memory. In 2018, the UK government outsourced health contracts worth £3 billion, putting 84% of beds in care homes in the hands of private sector operators. This outsourcing and the slow reaction of the central government should help explain why the UK has performed so badly. Take New Zealand as an opposite case. They outsourced nothing. The budget they created is what the lady that governs in the country, Jacinda Ardern, defined as a well-being budget, not one that is based on outsourcing, but on big government. And this is, I think, something that has been vindicated, and it will work or continue to have an impact on the process of deglobalization, which we already saw earlier. There are those who believe that authoritarianism has gained ground in this pandemic, I'm not sure this is true. I think that if you look at those countries that did better during the pandemic, they are mostly democratic, and building on the trust of civilians, of your citizens, is much more convincing than authoritarian measures. Look at authoritarian states, Russia, Iran, China. They didn't do particularly well. The Chinese, who knows exactly if their figures are reliable? When there was cover-up, when there is no trust, there is cover-up. Most of the states that did well were run by women, and this has to do with when people elect a woman, a young woman, such as the one in New Zealand and in I think Iceland or Finland. She's the youngest prime minister in the world, probably. This is the expression of trust in the work of government. It has the meaning of a democracy that is built on trust. And I think that this is a debate that is worth conducting, because the Cold War that the Chinese and Americans are sliding into is also one of ideas. It is an authoritarian system versus or the capacity of organization of an authoritarian system with democracies. And we should insist that it is true that the most punished democracies or the most punished countries were democracies: the United States, Britain, Spain, Italy. But this has nothing to do with democracy. It has to do with the late response of the leaders, and some of them simply do not believe in science, do not believe in experts, such as Boris Johnson, let alone Donald Trump. Now, as to the more international scenario, before the pandemic, we saw that the resistance to diplomatic solutions has been common to most of the major conflicts. Vladimir Putin's revisionism has launched NATO into the biggest military build-up in Russia's borders since the Cold War. This revisionism, in spite of the setbacks that he suffered during the pandemic, still persists. His approval rate hasn't been lower than it is today, precisely because of the bad or of the weak performance of the president during the pandemic. But yet he will not give up Russia's revisionism, particularly when he has in the United States a president that is rather friendly. And in East Asia, a region where you have 4 nuclear states and no minimal architecture, regional architecture of regional security and stability, scholars started to speak before the pandemic of the Thucydides trap. The Thucydides trap, you certainly know, is Thucydides' concept. He was the historian 2,500 years ago of the Peloponnesian War, and where he showed that whenever a rising power challenges an established power, war becomes inevitable. And in this case, China is the rising power. She challenges the established power, which is the United States, and then war becomes inevitable. I will say one thing about it in a moment, but I just want to remind you of an official at the British Foreign Affairs Ministry in 1907. His name was Crow, and he wrote a memorandum, the name of which, or the title of which, is the Crow Memorandum. He wrote it in 1907. He explained that Germany had started to develop a naval military capacity, and this is a challenge to the United Kingdom's, to Britain's superiority, hegemony throughout the seas. And therefore he said war is inevitable. That was he said almost explicitly in his 1907 memorandum. So we are, and 7 years later we saw the war occurring. And Graham Allison, the professor in Harvard who wrote a book about it, found that from 19 cases which he studied of rising power challenging an established power, he found that in most of the cases war was the outcome. The only trick, as it were, in the US-China situation is that normally the rising power is supposed to challenge the status quo. In this case, Donald Trump, he turned Thucydides on its head, because the destabilizer is the United States. I mean, it's the established power that is deglobalizing, that is withdrawing from international agreements, that is leaving behind allies, NATO, defines the European Union as a foe, as an enemy, and comes closer to the dictators of the planet, starting with Kim Jong-un and then Putin, and he at some point also with the president of China. But the differences between the two nations are enormous in any case. So I think that all this, the guilt game between China and the United States throughout the pandemic is only one expression of the war that has been going on before. Today, we are in an era when you do not have to declare a war. Wars just, you slide into it, and you do not have necessarily to shoot. You can conduct war through trade, you can conduct war through cyber, you can conduct war through isolating diplomatically. There are many ways. Between Israel and Iran, there is a war going on for years, but it doesn't capture the headlines, because this is the kind of wars that you conduct in the 21st century. So we are in the middle of a war between China and the United States. I think that even though the pandemic, as we saw from Macron, will force the West to rely more and more on its capabilities rather than on the trade chain, I think that the rise of China, or the weight of China, is an irreversible reality. We are talking about a country that needs to feed 20% of humanity. This is a country that has brought into the middle class the biggest middle class in history, perhaps 500 million, maybe 600 million, maybe 800 million. It depends how do you define a middle class. this is a country that, unlike Indian democracy, has resolved the problem of hunger. This is a country that is the dynamo of consumption, the dynamo of consumption, and therefore it will be extremely difficult to avoid to avoid China. And if indeed the world is divided in two parts, with the competition also on technology, who knows? We might have not very simple dilemmas from some Western countries, whether the United States of Trump is the one they want to stick with. So much, of course, depends on what would happen after November 2000. But the possibility of a Cold War, where you will have two different systems of internet, two different systems of using technologies, two different languages, this is not too far-fetched, given the state of the situation and the fact that what we see after the pandemic is a deepening of the divisions between China and the West. However split and fragmented might the West be. China has been playing a sort of double game with globalization, and in that sense, Trump is right. If you look at Made in China 2025, the Chinese project of Made in China 2025, which is one way, one of the ways that they have to protect its technology, is essentially opening the markets of others while being much more closed to trade or to opening their own market to the others. Two interesting things happened immediately. It started before the pandemic, but are now being talked about after the pandemic in a much more emphatic way. And that is Chinese cryptocurrency, Chinese cryptocurrency. So far, we have known cryptocurrencies coming out of private companies, of private enterprise, of free enterprises. This is the first time we hear of a cryptocurrency that comes from a state, and not just a mediocre state, China. And the second thing is talks about a possible Chinese-led IMF. So I think that the pandemic deepened the divisions between the blocs and opened the gates for things that we saw before, but now are getting an additional momentum. Inevitably, we need to conclude that the rise of China is sort of connected vessels with the withdrawal of the United States from the business of the world. If you have an America that is isolationist and withdraws from global affairs, this inevitably leaves the panorama open for the Chinese. We cannot exaggerate the impact of Trumpian deglobalization and Trumpian abdication of alliances. If you take the case of East Asia, you see that South Korea and Japan simply do not trust that America would come to the rescue if there is Chinese aggression. In his next 5-year plan, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who is challenging the pacifist constitution of Japan, is going to spend $245 billion in new weapons, in rearming Japan. And this is the second 5-year plan of rearmament by the Japanese. I think that we cannot say that the post-pandemic politics have created a sense that any of the big powers is thinking of bridging the gaps that we saw taking place on the eve of the pandemic. We may even reach the conclusion that although we are prone to laying the blame for all the maladies of the international system on Donald Trump, the processes of withdrawal from commitments and the weariness of the American public from the missionary zeal of that we saw in the second half of the 20th century in American foreign policy, this started before Trump. The withdrawal from the Middle East started with Obama. When Obama declared, or rather it was Hillary Clinton in 2010, when she spoke about pivoting to the East, pivoting to the China, that is to the Pacific, because this is where the interest of the United States lie. Okay, so they withdrew from the Middle East, but they didn't convince the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Taiwanese and the Filipino that they will defend them in case China pushes too far her interest in the South China Sea. And it continues doing it persistently this very day, challenging India. There have been confrontations along the India-China border with the Philippines and others. So I think that this is something that perhaps does not depend on a single president, but it responds to a trend that there is a new generation of American politicians and diplomats who do not think that America should continue being the policeman of the international order, and the challenge that you see these days to the ICC, to the International Criminal Court. This happened before. Nobody would have thought in the Obama years that the Obama administration would allow an American general to be indicted by the prosecutor Fatou Bensouda in The Hague. So even the international law and international legitimacy and the international norms of conduct have been applied according to the balance of power, not according to universal justice. That is, nobody would dare bring a Chinese general or a Russian general to The Hague, but yes, defeated Bosnian or Serbian a warlord or an African dictator. This is very sad, but this is the reality that we knew before and are knowing now after. The expansion of NATO to the gates of Moscow was stopped before the pandemic, and nobody has any appetite these days to persist in trying to have Ukraine or Georgia to join join the Western alliance. Now the pandemic is bound to force the states to return back home, to deal with their own problems, to strengthen state capabilities, because the pandemic is around. It will not disappear. This generation will have an institutional memory of the pandemic as something that, even if it disappears, might return in another shape with another kind of virus. I think that in that sense, the centrality of the state, not relying excessively on international or multilateral institutions, is something that is going, I'm afraid, to be strengthened. Is this good? I think it is very, very bad. I think if this is consolidated, this is extremely bad, because there is one pandemic that there is no way, but no way, that states can resolve single-handedly, and that is climate change. And this is the real apocalyptic pandemic. This is the real apocalyptic threat that humanity faces, and it can't be solved by separate states. Moreover, those separate states that matter, such as the United States and China, which are the main polluters, they are mainly the United States has withdrawn from the climate change. And in that sense, unilateralism, patriotism, nationalism is the major enemy of the capacity, not only of fighting global challenges such as the current pandemic, but also almost terminal challenges for the planet as climate change. I think we should all hope that these negative processes that started before the pandemic, and the pandemic enhanced them, consolidated them, at least temporarily, this is a situation that needs to be superseded, because this is a small planet and we are interdependent. Nationalism is a bad advisor for an era of global challenges, be it a virus, be it climate change. So we need, hopefully, to see the emergence, the rise of new leaders, of new attitudes that will not reach the conclusion that what we need to do now is to close ourselves behind the walls of our own states and our own convictions, because this will be devastatingly bad for human civilization in the years to come. May I say a couple of words pro domo sua, that is a few words about the Middle East. I guess one would expect that I say a couple of words about it. Again, here you see the effects of unilateralism. The world has lost interest in this part of the world. It is so dysfunctional. It is so untreatable that you cannot reach settlements with regard to Palestine, be it Syria, Islamist terrorism, that it has become the backyard of God, not of the international community. There is no much interest, and this has allowed Donald Trump to open the gates of Syria for the Russians. It has allowed him unilaterally to gift Israel with the Golan Heights, with Jerusalem, and with now with a peace plan that is utterly unacceptable by the Palestinians, that presumably creates a state, a Palestinian state, but only of 70% of the land, a crippled state surrounded by Israeli presence and overwhelming security control by the Israelis. A major problem that, yes, is of world interest has to do with Iran. I think that was the last multilateral achievement that the international community can be proud of. The nuclear agreement with Iran, the 5P+1, that was a real multilateral agreement. And again, here, the unilateralist in chief, Donald Trump, withdrew from the agreement. If you see today the Iranians departing also from the agreement, violating the agreement, the main blame is not, that is the main blame is Trump's, obviously, but it is also Europe's. It reflects Europe's incapacity to fulfill its promise to the Iranians that it could be able to circumvent the sanctions. This is a reflection of the weakness of the euro. The euro is not a global, is not as global a currency as the dollar. Charles de Gaulle used to speak about what he called the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. He didn't like it. So, in fact, the Iranian revisionism of the nuclear agreement has to do with their disappointment that the Europeans were incapable of circumventing the sanctions, precisely because of the incapacity of the euro to control the international or to compete in the international financial system with the dollar. And this explains, in a way, also the attitude of the Chinese, their intent to fight this privilege, this exorbitant privilege of the dollar. But this is another dimension, I think, that emerges out of these days, that perhaps we can discuss. Okay, this is in bullet points, more or less, what I thought I should say.
Thank you very much, Professor Ben-Ami, for your very interesting presentation. One of the questions that have come in is, what do you think about the future of the liberal world order?
Well, I think that the liberal world order emerged after the Cold War, after the American victory but it was spoiled by the Americans themselves. I mean, it started, let us say, in 1989 with President George Bush. The presidency of George Bush's father was perhaps one of the best moments of the liberal order. His war in Iraq was a fully justified war, approved by the United Nations, with a coalition, with an international coalition against the illegal acquisition of territory by force. What could be more liberal order? Even countries such as Syria and Egypt, the entire Arab world, joined the coalition. And after the war in Iraq in 1991, all this coalition came to Madrid, to the Madrid Peace Conference, to try and make peace in the Middle East. So I think that was an attempt of conflict resolution, of the legitimacy of what the French call the droit d'ingérence, the right and obligation to interfere or to intervene in order to stop dictators from tyrannizing their people. That was something that we saw. Obama did not intervene to put an end to the use of by the Syrians of chemical weapons. He could have done it in the name of the liberal order, but he refrained from doing it, and he opened the gates to Russia. The ICC is one of the expressions of the liberal order. But once the United States, which is the founder of the liberal order, withdraws from it, then it doesn't have its main shield, its main protector. And with Europe split between a Western democratic, liberal part of the EU and an Eastern one that still is being drawn into its old roots with authoritarianism, with illiberal democracy, as you see in Hungary, you see in Poland, and Europe being incapable of standing to the hybrid war that Putin has been launching on her. So I think that a liberal order needs a superpower to stand behind it. All orders in history were orders established by the hegemonic power. If it was, what was the world order in the 16th century? It was the world order that created. What was the world order in the 18th century? It started with the British Empire, and the world order after the Second World War was dominated by the United States and by her competition with Russia. So if you do not have an hegemonic power that stands behind it, it deteriorates, it gets eroded. There are countries now in Africa, for example, that do not accept the jurisdiction of withdrawn from the jurisdiction of the International Court in The Hague. So I think that the rise of China, the rise of Turkey, the rise of Erdogan's Turkey, India, nationalism of Modi, Brazil, these are the biggest powers in the world, and they don't want the international order, the international liberal order, and they are not, and they are applauded and supported by the United States. They are all friends of Trump's foreign policy, Bolsonaro, Modi, Erdogan, and in a way Putin as well. So I think that the liberal order is fading out. It was based on multilateralism as well, and now we are seeing more and more unilateralism as a central component of international relations. Whatever happens here in the Middle East is unilateralism. Whatever happens in East Asia is unilateralism. Multilateralism is a word that is alien to the political vocabulary of the Chinese, and it is alien to the political vocabulary of the Trump administration, unless we see a different president in the coming month.
The next question would be, you have already mentioned that that you expect or hope that there will be new leaders who will be more multilateral in the future. But are we living in a time of deglobalization at the moment or not?
Well, I think there are processes of deglobalization that cannot be denied. If you look at the diminishing role of the United Nations, the diminishing role of the United Nations Security Council. You know, it started, if you look at the war in the Balkans. The war in the Balkans was done without the United Nations Security Council. NATO did not get United Security Council acceptance because of Russia's opposition. And then Russia's opposition was strengthened even more when the Americans asked to intervene in Libya for humanitarian reasons, and the Russians supported it. But then it became regime change, and the Russians got the message. For Russia and China, they would like to see a Westphalian world order, because you are not supposed to intervene in the affairs of other countries. When they say other countries, they mean themselves, because the liberal world order was supposed to intervene in autocracies, not in democracies. Democracies were not open to intervention because they run their business in a liberal way. So this is what we saw, that international trade agreements, the major economic power in the planet, does not form part, is not part of them. The Americans withdrew from all multilateral trade agreements. In his speech to the UN, last speech of Donald Trump to the UN, was perhaps the clearest ideological position that this man has ever articulated, where he says, we are against international institutions, we are against globalization, we are for what he called then in that speech patriotism. I think that you cannot have true globalization when the main economic power in the planet is not part of it, and when the competitor, in this case China, has this double game with globalization, that it, because of its extraordinary manufacturing capabilities of products in low, that is in a cheaper value, have invaded the planet, but they are much more close for the interference of others, to open their own markets. I think in this situation, the globalization becomes a reality. But this is not, however, an irreversible process. It can be reversed. It can be reversed if new leadership emerges. I think a Biden presidency can be a more globalizing presidency. That is a one that is much open to international trade, much more attentive to the issues of climate change and to the agreement, the Paris Agreement about climate change, which, by the way, separate American states, US states, like California and others, are abiding by the rules of the Paris Agreement against Trump's philosophy, which means that there is a fertile ground in America for liberal policies, for globalizing policies. And this much depends on new leadership that can reset relations with China and reset relations with Russia.
Thank you very much. And the last question of this session comes from Ambassador Briggs.
Professor Ben-Ami, sorry for asking also a question, but it is more a confirmation. I fully agree that all the items that we have on the table internationally are, by the COVID crisis, like a fire accelerator. The conflicts, they get new momentum, as you said. That I fully agree, but I'm not so totally skeptical about the liberal world order as you are, because maybe there is one partner in the equation which you didn't talk too much, and that is Europe. There is a potential, I think, for Europe to have a new role, especially in the multilateral dialogue, especially in the norm setting, especially in trade regulations, especially also in some innovation ideas, especially in privacy laws and so on. So do you agree that Europe might have a special role in the situation?
I fully agree with you. I fully agree that Europe is perhaps the last bastion of a liberal order. Europe was never built on the idea of doing away with the nation state. What it tried to do is to turn the nation state into one platform for benign regional cooperation and doing away with the threat of war in Europe. And I think in that sense, the achievement is enormous. And I am one who thinks that Europe, even though she was amid the Euro crisis and the 2008 depression, etc., I think that it fully deserved the Nobel Peace Prize that the Norwegian decided to give to Europe, because I think that Europe still inspires. It inspires, but again, if I may add, it is extremely difficult, Mr. Briggs, this is my historiographical belief, if I may. Yeah, it is extremely difficult in the current world affairs to be able to inspire if there is no degree of intimidation. That is, the problem of Europe is that it inspires but does not intimidate. And precisely these days when NATO is no longer that reliable because of Trump's policies, the capacity of Europe to prevent, to stop the gravitation of the countries of Eastern Europe to more Russian influence, its capacity lies not in its inspiration, or not exclusively in its capacity to inspire, but also in its capacity to intimidate the Russians, but it doesn't have that capacity. So I think that sooner or later, what Macron and others say, you know, Angela Merkel herself talked not long ago about that Europe needs to take care of herself. But Germany itself hasn't reached the 2% of GDP for security, for military investment for NATO. I mean, that's the other half that Europe needs to have in order to be a more convincing bastion for the liberal order. Without Europe, I think we will all drift to Westphalia. That is, that everybody, we have the states, etc. And I think that's the only part of the world that still is free of conflict, is free of wars, has open borders, with the inevitable problems from, you know, you close Schengen from time to time because of a concrete problem, but Schengen is there, and Europe is an inspiration for the world. But, you know, a utopia that is surrounded by enemies, or is surrounded by systems that do not share the utopia, is something that it's very difficult to persist. You know, I will bring you an example. You know, if I may, that might sound to you outlandish, but I believe it is a case in point. You know, in this country, in Israel, for many years, we had an utopia, and it was a kibbutz. The kibbutz was sort of small agrarian community that lived a full-fledged communist life, but with freedom. Communism without freedom, with freedom, sorry. communism without gulag, I wanted to say. So, and it was an extraordinary way of life, a total utopia. It does no longer exist. It no longer exists because in its best years, the surrounding Israeli society saw it as a model, wanted to imitate it. Everybody was very proud of having lived at some point in his life in a kibbutz. Now, when society changed and became more capitalistic, more hedonistic, more privatizing, what happened with the kibbutz, it lost its appeal, and it started to copy the surrounding society. It changed the utopia into something, average way of life, like everybody else.
Yeah.
I think that if Europe doesn't want to become a utopia surrounded by the Erdogans of the world, by the Bolsonaros of the world, by the Netanyahus of the world, if I may, and the Putins of the world, and the Trumps of the world, it needs to be capable of have its own defense capability.